Hi there. Welcome to the first video lecture. I guess on the syllabus I call them videos for History 201, the first part of the United States History Survey. My name is Patrick O'Neill, and this particular video is meant mostly to explain why we are doing these videos. They are a little bit ironic or surprising given the fact that, in my opinion, reading is still particularly the best way to do history. It's the best way to study history, it's the best way to learn about history, it's the best way to think about history. So doing these video lectures is kind of a new thing and kind of a strange thing for me. Let me stress that reading is by far the best way to do history, and we are going to do a whole lot of it in this class. Let me show you. In particular, we are going to read from this book and from other related documents. This is called Documents to Accompany America's History. It's edited by a guy named Melvin Yazawa, and it's chock full of really interesting primary documents. So I want us in this class to focus on these primary documents, documents that were written at the time that the historical events they describe were happening. And because I want to focus on these documents, that means I have decided not to have a secondary text for the class. That is to say, there's not going to be sort of a history book, a narrative history that tells you what happened first and then what happened second. So let me suggest, for what it's worth, that if you would like to read a narrative history, nobody's stopping you. And in fact, I'm totally in favor of it. If you'd like to read a narrative history of the United States, I even have a couple suggestions. The first suggestion I might make is Hugh Brogan's book called The Penguin History of the USA. Why, here it is. It's The Penguin History of the USA. And the second one I might suggest is Paul Johnson's A History of the American People. Why, there it is right there. Such excitement. Both of these are interesting, they're a little weird, they're thoughtful, I really like them, and they do a decent job of sort of giving you an accessible vision of what happened first, what happened second, what happened third, etc. So if you'd like to read a narrative history, these are two that I might recommend. If you find something else, I suggest that you go read it, because it's healthy to do that reading. So, that said, these videos are going to take the place in some ways of a narrative text like this. And that is not to say that they can really replace a narrative text like this. Instead, they're meant to give you a little bit of a shortcut, a little bit of a leg up on what you're not getting because you're focusing so much on those primary documents. And the point here is not really to use these videos to tell a story. Instead, it's to let you know before you come to class that what we're talking about is stuff that historians are still arguing about today. It's stuff that historians aren't sure about, or they've got one theory and then someone else has another theory. It's still worth arguing about. So these lectures should be windows into arguments that other people are having and ways for you to maybe think about arguments that you might engage yourself. So there's an old New Yorker cartoon, you can see it right here, that shows what the United States of America, and in some ways the world, looks like to a New Yorker who lives downtown in the 1970s. I love this cartoon because it shows just how myopic, how narrow the view of those New Yorkers might have been. You can see they know a whole lot about maybe 2 or 3 blocks of New York, and then suddenly they've got Jersey, and suddenly they're skipping to Kansas City and Chicago, and then to my home state of Nebraska. Las Vegas pops up, LA pops up, and suddenly we're in Japan. In a way, that's how we're going to do history, but we're going to try and do it a little bit smarter than that. You simply cannot look at 350 years of American history and tell the whole story. Instead, we're going to have to choose little bits of it. This New Yorker right here focuses a lot on, these 2 blocks or so. We won't do that. We're going to focus on, say, something happening out here or something happening here. We can't cover it all, but I want us to piece together these snapshots into narrative threads. I want us to take what's happening somewhere in the southeast and use it to tell us, the southeast, and use it to tell us about European colonization or about slavery. So we're going to be using the sort of snapshot vision of American history. So here's another way to illustrate the difference between what traditionally you do in a history class and what we're going to be doing with these videos and in class ourselves, hopefully using these videos and your readings as a jumping off point. Here's a suggestion of what a traditional history narrative might look like. It's a straight line. It goes from left to right, from the past to the future, and it tends to head forward. This happened first, this happened second, this affected this, etc. So that's sort of a traditional history narrative. Now here is a way that people have revised that traditional history narrative. This was going on, say, in the 1940s and 1950s. So prior to that, most histories had been written, here's what happened first, here's what happened next. By the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, people started saying, well, okay, that was happening, but maybe it actually was happening this way. Or if we look at the experiences of these other people, it was happening this way. And perhaps let's jump off there and see, okay, this changes the story in this way. And so people were coming up with different narratives, but they were still sort of based on the notion that there is one big master narrative, one big story that everyone ought to know and ought to learn about. So that is sort of the way that history narratives were revised. Now just wait for what's coming next. Right here is how we are going to be doing history, and frankly how most modern historians do history. This is grown-up stuff. So you see the traditional narrative, it still exists, people are still aware of it, and it's really important to be aware of it. There are branches coming off. Okay, fine. But now's where things get interesting. People start looking at evidence in a different way, or they start saying, oh, I've got different evidence, or my evidence contradicts your evidence, or I'm not sure if my evidence contradicts your evidence. Let's keep looking at it. Here are lots of little things that seem to point in the same direction, and you notice they don't necessarily go in the same direction as the traditional narrative. Notice that in this fiction that I'm setting up of how people do history, that a lot of these ideas don't go in the same direction. Also notice that most of them intersect with this large traditional narrative. Now, this is admittedly more confusing, harder, more in-depth, more problematic than this standard traditional narrative. It's just true. It's tougher. It takes more work. But I also want you to see how this image has changed from the previous one. So if you look at these two narratives together, you'll see this top one here is in some ways just so boring, and it also doesn't seem necessarily true. Look at what happens here. We get a much richer experience. We start to figure out how Americans, in our case, or historical actors in general, are interrelating with each other, how their stories end up changing that first narrative. In some ways, they end up messing with the first narrative. It's fuller, deeper, and richer. We have probably lost that sense of a straight, easily digestible narrative, but what we've got is simply more interesting. It's also more connected. It suggests how we can use the experiences of, say, Native American women in Michigan to tell us about the whole project or process of Indian-European contact. So that's in a way what we're going to be doing in this class, but it's also in a way how I want you to think of these videos. These videos are meant not to tell you this straight narrative. Instead, these videos are going to give you, here's what some historians have done, perhaps here's a slice of the larger narrative, and here are things that other historians are doing that are causing problems for this larger narrative. The point there is to give you a truer sense of what historians are doing, but it's also meant to give you a sense that, or give you openings into how you can contribute to that larger narrative, or how you can change that larger narrative, how you can use evidence and use facts to mess with what other historians have done, to correct the mistakes of other historians. And that's actually where history gets interesting and where it gets exciting. So that's all for this time. If you're thinking about what we're doing, think about this whole mess of jumbly squiggles over here, and I think we'll get off to a good start. Thank you all. I'll see you in a minute.